Right, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? You're all muted, good. My name's Lewis Normand. Welcome to this first Green Theatre discussion panel, where we're going to be looking at hot trends and blends in horticulture. I'm the sales manager at Bernard's Nurseries, and we have today a panel of nursery men and women and also designers to discuss where we think the plant market is heading in terms of colours, trends, styles and new plants, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm a plant fanatic, and I also write a piece in Pro Landscaper magazine on a monthly basis that you may have seen. This session's been a long time in the making. We were expected to do this a couple of times, and unfortunately, due to COVID, we've not been able to, but it's great to finally be able to realize this and speak with one another. Without further ado, I'm going to get everyone to introduce themselves and to say a little bit about their company and their interests in plants. Does anybody want to volunteer start?
Yeah, go on then.
Right, Josh, I'm going to say, Josh, over to you first.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joshua Noakes. I'm a master's student here at the University of Sheffield. I'm studying landscape architecture. I'm currently in the final year of my studies. And while I've been studying, I've also been working for Fabric Landscape Architects who are based in Hampshire. Prior to my time at university, I worked as a soft landscape foreman for 5 years. In 2015, I was selected as one of the inaugural 30 under 30s by Pro Landscaper. Onto the topic of plants, my favourite new plant is probably Achillea Firefly Amethyst. It's sort of a great drought-tolerant plant that really thrives in sort of poor soil conditions. My least favourite new plant is probably Cornus Altenfolia Golden Shadows. The main reason being I'm not a huge fan of variegated foliage. Me, personally, with variegated plants, you don't really get the benefit of flowers. They're sort of dominated by the bright foliage. And in the planting scheme, they really tend to stand out as well. So it's quite hard sometimes to sort of find a complementary species. They're really not subtle. For future plant introductions, this is very aspirational, but coming from a sort of commercial design perspective, I would really love to see the introduction of sort of more drought-tolerant species cultivars. I think given our current climate crisis, our towns and cities are sort of becoming increasingly hotter, and we're tending to find our native palette is really struggling to deal with these situations in urban areas. And this is one of the reasons we're really starting to see more non-native species dominating modern schemes. So this is one area theoretically where I'd love to see more diversity, but I guess only time will tell. Brilliant,
thank you, Josh. Lee, could you introduce yourself, please? Hang on, unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, mute myself, yeah.
Morning, everyone. My name's Lee Burkhill, otherwise known as the Garden Ninja. I'm an award-winning garden designer and vlogger. I've got a crazy passion for plants. I'm a career changer, and my vlog and blog are really out there to try and encourage new gardeners to start. So these are sort of accidental gardeners or people that otherwise will be put off. So I use my design practice to then influence all these new gardeners and showing them the hows, the whys, and to give them kind of a taste and a flavour and an explanation of why we design in certain ways, why we use certain plants, and to really kind of take them away from looking at gardens as a fixed, static piece of design to really understand that it's a living, breathing, evolving process. So I'm all about getting people involved in accepting and loving the process of both design and gardening. In terms of favourite new plants, I'm probably a bit controversial. I really like the Hydrangea Runaway Bride series, just because it's brought back hydrangeas. For many years, they were just thought as sort of granny's garden plants. There's a huge variety. Runaway Bride isn't necessarily the best, but I think for new gardeners that want to kind of like sort of dip their toes in, it's a really good example. Just like Josh, I'm really kind of not a big fan of variegated plants. I find more often than not, they look nice in a catalogue. They capture people's sort of untrained horticultural eye, but in the garden, they're hard to blend with. Sometimes they're not the strongest of species. So yeah, anything variegated, I'm a little bit turned off. But otherwise, in terms of new plants that I'd like to see, I agree with Josh, but I would also like to see almost like a move back to more wildflowers in our gardens. And I think that some of the plant developers could really jump on the back of the current trend for more naturalistic planting in putting together even samples of maybe 3s and 6 native plants together, or wildflowers, for consumers to say, look, here you go, you've got 3, start with that. And then that will also spur them on and give them that taster for how amazing their gardens could be for wildlife.
Brilliant, thank you, Lee. Liz. Don't forget to unmute.
There we are. Good morning. Hello, my name is Liz Hughes. I work for Provender Nurseries. I've been here 12 years. And like all of you here, I think I'm a bit of a plant nut as well. My very small garden is packed to the brim, and the only way I can make it any more, to get any more plants in, is to buy next door's garden, but he's not going to let me do that. Right, so in terms of my favourite new plants, I must admit I have a bit of a leaning towards the Calicanthus. There's some lovely new Calicanthus coming on over the last few years. And one of the ones is Aphrodite, although it was patented back in 2013, which is a few years ago now. It's actually really only been available on the market easily the last sort of 2-3 years. And it's just an excellent flower. It's one of those flowers that you sort of walk past and you think, well, what on earth is that? And it makes you stop and have a look. And I think if a plant makes you stop and have a look because it intrigues you, then for me that's always a good thing. My least favourite plant, and any students, I do a lot of work with students at Provender Nurseries, and any student that's visited Provender Nurseries will know the answer to this question. My least favourite plant is anything that begins with the word heuchera. I know, I'm really sorry, they're very popular. I know, it's one of our most popular lines, but I just cannot abide them. The two people before me were talking about variegated foliage, and it's just those bright orange, those lime marmalades, and for me, I'm afraid my eye stops on them for all the wrong reason. It stops my eye going around the garden because I look at that and I think, what on earth is that? I have been known to call them pavement pizzas in the past because I really dislike them. However, I am aware that they're an excellent plant and used a lot by people, but they wouldn't cross my doorstep. In terms
you don't have to like it to be able to sell it, do you? That's the thing.
No, exactly. In terms of future plant productions or plant introductions, I mean, as a nursery person, as a supplier, and someone who deals with customers all the time, we always get asked for that fabled low maintenance plant that doesn't require watering, feeding, or pruning, and that flowers in exactly the colour that their client actually wants, and also at a really good cheap price too. But realistically, that's never going to happen because you've got to tick so many boxes. I think for me, I'm a bit of a foliage person as well. Anything that could expand some of the hardy schefflers, for me personally, I'd be really, really, really interested in. I've got a couple in the garden and I've got a few in the house. So I'd love to move the ones from the house out into the garden. So something that has some really good, strong foliage form that either stands on its own as an accent plant or something that you can use in amongst planting with ferns and those sort of foliage plants.
Lovely,
hardy
thanks.
schefflers.
Yeah, great plants. And finally, last but not least, Simon.
Good morning, everybody. Simon from How Green Nursery, family business based in Kent. We're in our 40th year come next year, which I didn't think we'd say before the pandemic set about. So we're reaching quite a landmark. We've got about 500,000 plants on site a year, predominantly herbaceous perennials, ornamental grasses. In fact, our niche is in growing a lot of new introductions. And we sit in a sort of our market is both garden designer, landscaper, and also retail, so garden centres. So new plants are quite sort of focal in both kind of aspects of our business. Best new plant or new introduction, there's so many new plants coming out at the moment. I think some of the standouts this year for us have to be Erigeron Kovinskianus Lavender Lady. Erigeron Kovinskianus being one of our best-selling plants, or from a volume perspective, in a long way. It's a new colour break. Flowers as Kovinskianus does, forever and a day. You've got that, say, new colour. A new range of strands here called Sparkling Stars, absolutely brilliant, really floriferous, a range of colours, and the flowers are about half the size again as a lot of other strands here. There seems to be a running theme insofar as least favourite plants. It's all very subjective, so it's far from me to kind of downplay a plant, but I think variegation is again a bit of a I'm not so keen. There's a new plant called Sedum Atlantis, which was basically planted to the show at Chelsea last year. I just think it's hideous. It sells like hotcakes, but it's basically bright yellow flower over yellow variegated foliage. So whatever floats your boat, but not for me. Most kind of excited about insofar as new trials and new plants going forward are Echinaceas. A lot of the new cultivars on the market at the moment are absolute waste of time to be treated predominantly as an annual. They don't overwinter. It's not so much a cold thing, it's wet. And a lot of the new oranges, yellows look fantastic and look fantastic for that first summer, but they don't overwinter. Even under glass, we keep them really dry, we still lose 50%. There's a lot of breeding at the moment between a cross between Pallida and Purpurea with some really interesting results. So I'm really looking forward and hope there'll be some good cultivars soon on that front.
Brilliant. Okay, so basically everybody hates variegated plants is what I'm getting,
Yeah.
which is a terrible shame, really. And it strikes me as that there are a lot of very good variegated plants out there that we probably need to be a bit more amenable to. I think we've also acknowledged that you don't, as a salesperson or as a nursery person and as a designer, you don't necessarily have to love the plants that you're using. It's easier if you do, but you don't have to. If they're the right plants for the job and they're the right plants for your client and the situation, then that's the right thing for you to be recommending. So without further ado, then let's get into some more questions. But what I want to make sure our audience is aware of is that you can also ask us questions as you go along. So please feel free to put some questions in the last 15 minutes. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible. So we just lost Liz there briefly, but she's back again. Good. So Simon, you were sort of headed in a direction there with a number of new and up and coming plants. Every year we see hundreds. You and I and every other nursery sees hundreds of new introductions that we have to make a choice on as to whether we should commit to growing them speculatively and hoping that they're going to sell to our client base. Why should not just nurseries, but the consumer consider buying a new plant over tried and tested, safe and well-known varieties that are realistically probably a bit cheaper?
It's a great question. I know a lot of designers are a bit sort of wary of using new introductions, and I get that. They use a palette that they rely on, they trust, they've used, and so yeah, why would you stray off that path? Well, I think we sit in the camp of growing. There's two words: novelty. I hate to use the word novelty, but they tend to be for the garden centre sales. Your salvia hot lips, your variants of that. A lot of plants don't sort of cross over with being reliable. And with that, I mean hardy, longevity. I think from a designer perspective, to broaden your horizons with new plants. We as a business at the moment are focusing on a lot of plants that are sports of what's come before. So when I mean sport, it's a natural kind of genetic sort of mutation, if you like, of an existing plant. And the best kind of example I can give, really, to keep it simple, is geranium roseanne. Well, we all know how great a plant that is. I'm sure a lot of you use it in your designs. Well, there are sports, there's geranium lilacite, which is a lilac variant of roseanne. So you can trust and use it as you would do roseanne, but you've got a different colour. Geranium azure rush, which again is a sport which has got a mound forming compact habit. And so again, if you've got a small garden scenario where roseanne, is a bit too straggly and too big, then you've got, again, a plant you can rely on there. And I think that's the key point. We're sort of trying to pimp plants that are kind of, we're not trying to break the mold insofar as here's a brand new, never tried, never tested, but a variant of something you know and love. And I think also a lot of other plants are, the breeding's not all about, a new colour or sort of something to stand out. There's breeding in disease resistance, which I think is really important. Some of the old monadas we don't grow anymore, the bee balms, there's some really good cultivars that had disease mildew resistance bred into them. A lot of cultivars are more floriferous, are more hardy and got more seasonal interest. A lot of the new ornamental grasses have, so Miscanthus Ghana, for example, the foliage in the autumn turns a brilliant orange, burnt yellow, burnt orange, red, and it brings another aspect to a plant that it's a popular plant used in the garden, but with a twist at the end of the season. You're muted, Lewis.
That's me doing it this time. Yeah, sorry. Liz, can I ask the same question for you, please?
Yeah.
So where are we headed, and is it a good idea?
Well, I think I'm hoping we're all going to kind of come across the same sort of theme here. Josh mentioned earlier on plants that are more drought tolerant, and I think we have two things that I think are going to influence in the future. We've got the want for more biodiversity, and actually, plants that will survive the changing climate that we have. So, like Simon, you get the same old favourites on the quoting list all the time. And there's nothing wrong with those plants, but I always think Monarda, and he's taken my thunder there, is that, that's one of the best examples of good plant breeding. Monarda is a great plant for attracting bees. It's also a great plant for every pest disease you can possibly throw at a plant, to be fair. So, it's that if we can breed out or breed in better pest and disease resistance, then there's less need to use chemicals and the insecticides and things. And I think that these are really good traits for a new plant. If you can use less chemicals when you're planting them, or to leave them to grow, I think that's something that we really need to look into as an industry as a whole. Another example, of course, is that if we look at the Ilex crenata that was introduced a few years ago as a great alternative to Buxus. Now, I have had some real mixed reviews on Ilex crenatas. I had one lady say to me it doesn't make old bones, but actually Ilex crenata does work. It's just you need to use obviously ericaceous compost because it's an Ilex. So I think sometimes when new plants are introduced, people get so excited about the fact, oh yeah, it's a box replacement. I can chuck it in exactly the same place as a box. I think sometimes people forget that basic adage of, you need the right soil and the right plant for the right place. So, I truly think it's going back to it. I think it's the pest and disease resistance and the drought resistance, because all of these are excellent for the environment and obviously, reduce people's maintenance costs as well. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got two designers on the panel, and obviously a big part of the reason that nurseries like us are growing these plants is so that you guys buy them. By the way, there's a lot of hatred for all of the anti-variegated plant comments on the chat, so you're going to be answering some questions on that later on. What do you feel that as designers, are you more or less likely to use a new plant over one that you have seen in nurseries for years, even though, as has just been explained, the likelihood is we've got more resilience to pest and disease, probably better flowering, even though you may be paying more for it. And you are obviously taking a little bit of a gamble on what's going to happen. So Lee, can you answer that first, please?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And from a design point of view, with my clients, a lot of the time I'll have clients that come to me with maybe a sample of 3 or 5 plants that they've either found in a catalogue, they've seen at one of the flower shows, and they say, you know, I must have one of these. I really like it. I like the look. And that's one way that sort of as designers, we start to use new plants, but I always take a step back with the client and say, well, let's have a look at those plants, and you know, you like the look of them. Let's see if they're suitable. Let's see if there's even better alternatives. And a lot of the time I will go back to a nursery, or if I'm working with you, Lewis, I might say, you know, I'm looking for agastache, and the client wants this very, you know, compact squat form, and I'm not too sure. And you then come back with, well, have a look at this. It's new, it's come in. And so it's that evolving process. I mean, I'm a bit of an old classic, I suppose. I stick to what I know, but I will incorporate new plants if they meet the needs of both the client and the garden. You're right in that a lot of the new plants have had issues either bred out of them or they're more resilient, which is great for a new client, especially a new gardener who's already a little bit tentative and might not have the desired skill or time to properly look after the garden. When I'm out and about at nurseries, I'm always looking at those new varieties, and I think speaking to the people that have had first-hand experience of them, or even speaking to the people that have been involved in breeding and in creating them is really useful. But I think it's about going back to the right plant for the right place and understanding the plant. From a client perspective, that's often what's missing. They see the beautiful, gorgeous end result of probably years of hybridizing and breeding and think, I want that, but it's about, well, where's it going to go? Is it suitable? And it's moving away from that. Everything has to be this high, compact, flowering for 9 months of the year. And I find, especially with clients over the past few years, for design in particular, people are much more aware of seasonality. So, you know, we're moving away from that. I want 10 months of colour with no maintenance, evergreen, everything glossy, bish bash bosh, into a more seasonal approach where clients want to see plants, shrubs, trees change over the seasons and are willing to accept that there's probably a little bit more maintenance, but they've got a much more diverse garden or landscape. And I think for some of those new plants, it would be nice to start incorporating that and getting clients to understand that plants are seasonal. You know, they're not meant to be fixed as an oil painting, a period in time. It's, you know, they're going to evolve, they'll grow, they'll die at some point. You know, everything has a finite life. So I think from a design point of view, and as horticulturists, we are starting to shape people's expectations of gardens and plants rather than them being decorative or like an interior design approach. We're helping people understand that it's an evolving process, and these new plants are very much at the sort of the front of that evolution of design and choice.
Brilliant, thank you. Josh, what's your take on it as someone studying and using the University of Sheffield programme? What's the feeling on new plants?
I think from a sort of commercial design perspective, it's quite hard to introduce sort of new species straight away into sort of public realm or commercial schemes. On the commercial level, sort of plants are exposed to a lot more stress and sort of unsuitable growing mediums. And sort of commercial maintenance output levels sort of tend to vary from domestic levels, really. Often there's less budget for maintenance, which means often less care and attention. For that reason, there's still this kind of established sort of commercial plant palette that, you know, as a sort of commercial designer, you know these plants will be able to thrive and adapt in these situations. But I do think as designers, we need to really take risks, though. If we don't, and we don't know how things are going to change or adapt, and I think it does depend on the client as well. Just drawing back again what I said on this drought tolerant kind of movement coming in. So a lot of stuff in city schemes now, in urban schemes, is based really from North American prairie species. So these species, if you look at most commercial schemes, especially in city centres, 9 times out of 10 they are really sort of heavily dominated by North American prairie species such as verbena, echinacea, rudbeckia. I think there was this kind of shift towards this naturalistic way of planting and sort of greening up our cities. In terms of driving the change, from my perspective, it's really a mixture between sort of academic research and a little bit of a sort of a design-led approach. Just quickly, an example which combines both of these is actually can be seen in Sheffield. There's a really sort of famous planting scheme. It's a commercial sort of led planting scheme called the Greater Green. And this scheme, a lot of academic research went into really the sort of drought-tolerant plant species, and the university looked at plant families from North America, from the Mediterranean, and from sort of Central Asia. And a lot of these species in the scheme are sort of hail from these families. It's actually, in terms of some of the plants, it's the first time they've really sort of been used in city schemes. And it's interesting to see how some have failed and some have really thrived. And it's great that the council's really placed trust in the scheme, and it's great to see. If you're not familiar with the scheme, I'll definitely recommend having a look. If you go onto Nigel Dunnett's website, it's called the Greater Green Scheme, and it showcases a really sort of fantastic range of this new sort of drought-tolerant planting that's coming into cities. So for me, that's quite exciting.
So obviously the drought-tolerant element is a really important thing going forward. Obviously, we also have the problem that we have particularly wet winters, and so it's not just the hot, dry summer issue, but we also have the then getting drowned in the winter months. And Simon alluded earlier to issues that we have with a lot of modern echinaceas, and Lee's commented on everything being this big. Yeah, that big, thank you. So breeding, the question's really got to be, is breeding headed in a direction that's steered towards a consumer, or is it being focused on the needs of our future planting? And if we start with Lee on that one, please, where are we headed, and is the breeding in the right direction?
I think the breeding's in the right direction for sales, which is probably not what people want to hear. I think that there is a time and a place for that knee-high compact plant, whatever that is. I think for most gardens, it's probably the wrong choice, because you end up with what I call a chocolate box of plants that are all the same height, the same width. And sort of a non-designer or a new gardener is tempted just to lay them all out in a very formulaic fashion. And it ultimately leads to disappointment, a bit of a lack of diversity, because a number of those plants usually are sterile or have been messed about with so much that, you know, they're just not the best plant to really encourage wildlife. So I think they look nice. I can understand the issue with trying to transport many plants on fewer lorries in smaller spaces. I get that. But I do think there's a huge educational piece with the public and garden centres to really explain to the public that just because you're buying a plant that's this big now doesn't mean that it can't be, you know, 4 times the height later on, and that height should not be feared in a garden. It's a really necessary design element. So I think we could still distribute plants at that height and showcase them for people, but I'm not sure. In fact, I know that shouldn't be the end game. And I know from a lot of clients and people on my vlog who will be asking question after question about small, you know, rotund plants that survive 11 months of the year. And once I explain to them, you know, you've got 369,000 plant species, known plant species, that there's a huge variety of diversity out there. And we should look into that further and pick plants that are best suited. Once you explain that to people, then they start to shake their heads at those varieties and go, oh, actually, I was wrong. I didn't want something that stays this size. And you can kind of open their eyes to, you know, a plethora of different plants. So I think we should return to, as people have said on the panel, right plant for the right place, plants that will deal with challenging environmental issues that are only going to get worse, and to really bring in wildlife and diversity, because that in turn reduces pests and diseases. It keeps much more of a balance. So from my perspective, I think that maybe especially garden centres and some breeders could do with getting away from that knee-high plant, and even on the plant labels, giving a bit of blurb to excite, to encourage people to choose species that will get bigger or wider or taller, or may need cutting back a bit more often. And I think that's the way that we really expand into new gardening territories and get people excited about new plants.
Good, thank you. So Liz, from a nursery perspective, are we breeding the right way, and why do you think the little compact plants are being bred primarily?
Well, I think it's quite a difficult one actually, because I think if you're looking at people who buy plants on a regular basis within the industry, you've got three very different types of customers. You've got your landscape architects, you've got your designers, and you've got your landscapers. And I would assume, and it is a big assumption, that all three of these, that each one of these three categories looks for something different within a plant. You know, as we've alluded to, the landscape architects want something that has a low maintenance because the value, because the maintenance budget is quite small. Landscapers and designers probably wouldn't, you know, that probably wouldn't be their first accolade for the plants. It's quite difficult really, because I mean we have, like yourselves, you know, we get quite a few new plants in, and you can put across your message to customers that these particular plants do this wonderful thing. But then, you know, the difficult thing to actually get across to people is A, the correct information, B, that message more than once, because nobody takes in the information first time round. You know, you need to sort of say the same thing 2 or 3 times, to be honest. And also you've got to get everybody on site behind you to understand it as well. You know, and obviously this, you know, this is where everyone has their different plant likes. This is always going to be a slightly difficult one to get across. But I think it's really difficult to know from a breeder's perspective which sort of angle you're coming at. You know, if you're coming to designers, then they want something that is, you know, floriferous, or, you know, some more unusual colours, or as Simon said, you know, something new on an existing very popular plant like the echinaceas. But I think the landscapers again would probably want something that is slightly less maintenance, or it's very difficult to know which audience you're aiming it at. So it's very difficult sometimes to know for the breeders to get it right. But I think Lee has hit the nail on the head in terms of, at the moment, it seems to be very easy to find plants that are grown for smaller gardens. And I think that is a huge influence as well. Gardens are getting smaller. The people are craving their privacy more. So, you know, things like fruits trees are selling really quickly. But also, you know, once you have that enclosed space where you're putting plants in, you want a small plant that does a lot. And that sort of seems to be the main thing at the moment, is looking for plants that grow smaller but that flower well. And it's you know, that can look quite contrived, like a chocolate box, as Lee said, but it can also, you know, in the right environment, be exactly what the client needs. It's really difficult to read what each level of the industry actually wants from a new plant. Everyone's different.
Yeah. Simon, what's your take on it? Because obviously that varied marketplace is an interesting one. I mean, one of my strong arguments for this super compact plant has always been that it's been basically dimensioned that way so you get the most on a trolley, and you get the most on a garden centre table. They're neat and tidy and uniform, but it doesn't make necessarily for great garden plants. And certainly that's pitching it very much at the garden centre's needs rather than the customer's needs.
Absolutely. I think you're right. It's to do with, you know, plants on trolleys, but also, you know, the life expectancy, shelf life of a plant in a 2-litre pot on a stand at a garden centre. If you've got something that grows 6 feet tall and blows over and, you know, loses its kind of saleability within a very short space of time, then so I kind of get that to a point. But I think the key thing when, or one good example is when Verbena lollipop was introduced, thinking, what's the point of that? Now, you've got Verbena bonariensis, which is a fantastic plant insofar as there's not many herbaceous give you the height. So why on earth would the plant breeders want to, you know, breed something that's 40, 35, 40 centimetres tall? And I still, to a point, don't really get that. Although we sell a shed load of it, you've got Verbena venosa or rigida that, you know, give you that sort of similar height, and that's been around for years. I think it's really important to understand that, you know, plant breeding is actually a huge business. You know, there are a lot of growers, individuals that, you know, it's their livelihood, and time and money, and a lot of these plants are copyrighted for a reason, because it enables that grower individual to put that out into the market, and each cutting, bear, whatever it might be, will carry a royalty. So that to them it's a huge business. But I think for me as a grower, and like I sit in that bank of supplying those dwarf plants for garden centres, and I get that market to a point. But I think what Lee alluded to, I think, you know, for the designer and that sort kind of market, you know, we as growers have got to kind of sift through the kind of the good and the bad. And I think, you know, it is a big business. Plants are named, you know, specifically to sell. And at the moment, you know, we're looking at plants next year, anemone frilly knickers. I mean, for goodness sake, you know, although it's a great plant, you know, we've got Philiptrum black stockings, we've got, you know, what else have we got?
You're headed down a dangerous route.
Actaea negligee. They say sex sells. There you go. But it's difficult to sift out of that what is a good and what isn't a good garden plant. So from our perspective, you know, there are some, what, you know, I keep using the word novelty sounding plants, but within that range, there's some damn fine introductions. And I think, you know, we trial plants here in a garden environment on the nursery. And so it is difficult sometimes to you know, you've got to sort of take the name out of the equation. You've got to look at the plant and it's, you know, sort of for what it is, and it is a bit of a minefield to kind of, you know, what's a good and bad one. But hey, like I say, it's a huge business.
Absolutely. Josh, what's your take on this? You know, from a larger landscape design perspective, obviously plant use is typically bolder. The trend towards creating smaller plants, or the general direction of plant breeding, is it helpful, or does it not really have a place in most modern landscape architecture?
I think introducing sort of any new plant into a commercial scheme holds an element of risk. I feel personally most of the new plants are sort of aimed at the sort of domestic and show garden level. As sort of commercial designers, we're always trying to pick up on domestic designs and trying to enlarge them and make a much larger scale. So I think in terms of a commercial designer, you need to be kind of careful in terms of plant selection. We've all touched on this before, but the conditions in which commercial sort of plants are exposed to are a lot different. You don't really have that time to do the maintenance, and you can do really on a domestic level. I think also cost plays a huge role. A lot of the new species that do come out are fairly expensive, and it's a very hard sell trying to get the client to pay that extra little bit just for this new species that comes out. But what Lee said previously was really key, though. It's all about the right plant for the right place. I think that's really key. And when you come to commercial design, you've also got to be thinking about who's going to be maintaining it as well. So who will be maintaining it? How will they be doing it? And the budget's really for that. I think there are a couple of exceptions to this, though. There's one of the plant families I really like, a Cornus. And there's in a recent few years, there's been a variety of Cornus Koisia that's come out. And it's made its way to its market. It's called Cornus Koisia Norman Haddon. And personally, I'm a huge fan of this plant. It's really, really good for growing in sort of poor soil conditions. And it's a cross between Cornus Koisia and Cornus capita. And it produces really nice sort of pink flowers in summer. And it's got some really nice red fruits as well towards the end. And it's a great sort of specimen for a sunny spot. But this is kind of an exception where if you take your client to look at these plants in nurseries, you can kind of, you know, sway them a little bit. But this is a plant that really, I think, is better almost in Cornus Koisia because it keeps its form much better. And I think it's generally a bit more, it's not as maintenance sort of heavy. But I think there are exceptions. But from a commercial perspective, you really got to think about the client and maintenance. So that's a big factor.
It's interesting because I know Cornice Norman Hatton from quite a long time ago, but it wasn't, I've never really seen it commercially available. So a lot of probably the more useful plants for larger scale commercial use actually are probably plants that have been in existence for some time, but the trends or the sort of modern touch comes from the fact that they've not really been commercially available. So we're seeing them with fresh eyes, even though they might be 50, 100 years old, or they may be species that have been around for thousands of years that are just making their way over, like the North American plants that you were talking about earlier, being a large part of our herbaceous planting schemes now. So it's quite an interesting time in that respect. Where do we see trends headed? We know where we're at, and we know that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and there are constant influx of new plants. Where are trends headed, and where should they be headed? Let's start with Lee. You've been quiet for a little bit. Lee?
Right, there we go. Yeah, I mean, I'm always apprehensive with trends because by their very nature, they're temporary movements and shifts in likes and dislikes. There has been a consistent trend for more naturalistic gardens, which in turn is leading towards more wildlife-centric gardens, which I know should always be sort of part of any garden. But I think people are far more aware than they ever have been. And I think lockdown has played a huge part in that this year. I must get hundreds of comments every month on different videos and blog posts about gardening for wildlife, how to do it, what native species can I introduce to my small garden. So I think that the trend really is about getting more out of your smaller spaces, encouraging wildlife, naturalistic in terms of lower maintenance. So I explained to a number of people online about, if you choose the right plants that will attract wildlife and will give interest, you can often leave a lot of them, especially grasses and some of the sort of the late season herbaceous perennials, you can leave them over winter, and you don't have to have an immaculate tidy garden. And sometimes the beauty of good design in gardens is seeing how they evolve and how they take their own form. So I think the trend really is about working with the seasonality and natural gardens. And I think people are slowly but surely getting on board with that because it's less effort for them, it's better for the environment, it gives them a bit more kudos probably when they're chatting with their mates about what they're doing with their garden. And I think, as I said, lockdowns really helped focus people on seeing their gardens rather than being something that needs to be immaculate all year round or something that's a bit of a pain in the backside. They've started to see it as a retreat, I suppose, from working from home or being stuck inside. And they're starting to shift and see them more as evolving spaces rather than what I used to call the interior design approach of garden design, where you do it, it looks gorgeous, and then the client wants it like that forever. So I think that the trend now is about the gardens evolving, which vicariously is a wildlife garden.
Yeah, absolutely. I think trends don't have to be about a hot new color or one of a handful of plants, but they can be very much on a theme that we can all buy into for good reasons. Yeah, Simon, what's your take on it? Sorry, go on, Lee.
Sorry. I think just one last point, it's almost impossible to change someone's colour preference. So whilst we have colour themes and trends, like you try and make me love certain colours and I just can't, and I appreciate them, but I think the colour trend's always a bit of a misnomer. I think people
What colours don't you love?
I mean, there's not very many. I'm not a big fan of pastel-y, pale pinks and washed out yellows. You know me, I'm a hot colour guy. Yeah. I love contrast, dynamic contrast for me. But yeah, I think colours are always a bit of a meh when it comes to plant trends.
Okay, great. Thank you. Simon.
As a nurseryman, I mean, we are led by trends, and that can sometimes be difficult because, we're growing literally a year ahead of your projected sales. So, when a trend comes around, and it's invariably kind of Chelsea that kind of, sort of brings these trends to the fore, it's kind of too late for us as a grower because we've got all that stock ready and waiting. But I think with the designer at the moment, and I say at the moment, it's been for a number of years now, and I think it's got longevity, and it goes back to the whole client brief. And the client brief is, we want this lovely garden, but hey, we haven't got time to manage it and look after it, and more importantly, they haven't got the skill set to. I don't mean to generalise, but you know that's what people still want. But Lee's right insofar as I think sustainability, and also from a wildlife perspective. And yeah, Lee's right. There are a lot of sort of indigenous plants that people can use in their gardens. And Noel Kingsbury and Pete Udolph, certainly people think that style's old hat. Well, I totally disagree. You know, they're taking it on one stage further and incorporating a lot of indigenous plants into regional specific species into gardens. But I mean that's generally on a big scale, I think. But where new plants can actually have a place in those schemes are there's work being on some of the ragged robins, which are fantastic. Lychnis petit Henry, and I know, sorry Lee, I know the word petit probably makes you cringe, but it's a good 50 centimeters tall, but it flowers and flowers and flowers and flowers and flowers. Great for pollinating insects, and that goes for a lot of sort of new cultivars, Agastache, that again fantastic pollinators. So I think it does come back to client brief, but within that, like I say, there are a lot of plants you can bring into the garden that give that are good for wildlife, certainly. And from a colour perspective, I don't think, again, you can really sort of pinpoint a colour. I know they tend to do that at Chelsea, but I think a lot of that's to do with what's actually, available at the time insofar as weather patterns and that side of things. But I think how I'm looking at new plants as a grower is what a plant can give. And by that, I mean, seasonality insofar as, some of the Hacknacloas now, Hacknacloa Benicardi, it's plain green throughout the whole growing season, and then wham, in the autumn you get this lovely burgundy overlay. So, all right, that's not a colour trend, but it's certainly something that, from a seasonal perspective, as far as colour goes, gives an added dimension.
Yeah, seasonal value is becoming a running theme here. Let's see if it continues. Liz, what do you feel is where we're sort of moving in terms of our plant breeding? Is it right? Is it helping us? Colour trends?
Well, I think in terms of trends, as Simon said, trends, well, everyone said really, trends can hit and fall so quickly that by the time any of the growers have started growing something, the next trend is already here. I mean, if you take this year as an example, the trends this year that we found at the beginning of the year was for anything and everything, grow your own. Everybody's at home, everybody's on lockdown, everybody wanted to be growing their own fruit and veg. And that's still sort of slightly the case later on in the year. But, for those first 2-3 months of lockdown, you just couldn't get enough fruit and veg and or bedding plants, as we all know. And I think seasonality, I think autumn used to be quite overlooked or kind of ignored as a season. If you look back at the old gardening and gardening books, there's always the beautiful sort of summer colour, and then there's the winter structure. But autumn was always kind of overlooked. I think now, in particular where our summers are getting later, people are out in the garden a lot later and actually, still going on to those autumn months. So anything that brings colour and structure in that season of the year, I think is really gaining in importance. And things, some of the tall structural grasses, the miscanthus and things, some of the changes that have gone on in those in terms of plant breeding and the sizes that are available and the different colours, I think that's a real good way forward, because, miscanthus, or you look at grasses in general, they have a multitude of uses. They're not just a pretty grass to stick amongst the perennials. You've got them, the taller miscanthus you can use as hedges and things like that. So that I think autumn's really become a hugely important season now. And again, part of that would probably be the growing your own. There's all these Facebook posts at the moment, look, I harvested 2 parsnips this year, that sort of thing. But if this is what people are getting enjoyment out of in their own gardens, then, I think actually a sort of a small space towards growing your own is probably somewhere to go towards,
Great. Josh, the landscape architecture market is obviously quite a different one to smaller commercial project. Grow Your Own, I mean, maybe doesn't have the same kind of position except in community gardens. Where are trends headed in landscape architecture?
Really, from a commercial design perspective, we're starting to see that the climate crisis is having a really big influence really on the next generation of plants. I think everyone's touched upon, but at present there's this really big shift towards biodiversity and sort of naturalistic planting. We're starting to see that ornamental grasses are starting to have a resurgence, say species like miscanthus and calamagrostis, and they're really starting to hit the kind of the spot we need for these plants that can survive in urban situations. And we're also tending to find that these grasses sometimes make the basis for mixes in city schemes now. So a lot of our herbaceous perennials revolve around these grasses, which is good. In terms of trends, from a commercial perspective, I think we tend to look at projects across the globe. There's a really good website called Landzine, which really just showcases all of the best landscape architecture projects across the globe. It's almost like a bit like an Instagram, but for planting designers, really. And it's interesting to see how other practices globally and designers are sort of approaching planting design. An example in context of this can be sort of seen with the High Line. The High Line was a huge project in New York, and since it opened in 2009, there's this real big push towards shade-tolerant planting. The High Line boasts a really fantastic sort of shade-tolerant woodland edge of the garden within it. And one species used in abundance was Brunner. And for me, I find it quite funny that ever since I've seen this being something kind of documented, and it blew up quite massively, that Brunner has become very trendy again now since then. You see it in a lot of London courtyards. And for me, I think looking at global projects really gives you some sort of perspective. But equally, keeping in touch with nurseries as well. Nurseries are pretty much key. They also tend to find trends. And as landscape architects, we kind of bow down to their superior knowledge, and that they really do assist us in many of our projects. So it's good. I think it's good to have this base that you can keep up with trends and so forth. But no, it's an interesting question, and I think you just got to do a bit of research as well. Just keep on top of it. But yeah.
So trusted relationships with nurseries are obviously a big factor there then in ensuring that you've got the best information on new plants and understanding what's coming out and why you should buy it over something else. As you pointed out earlier on, quite correctly, a lot of newer introductions are more expensive. And one of the things that obviously we need to consider is that justifiable in commercial planting? Can you easily sell a greater expense for a greater overall value? So Lee, is it easy for you to do? Can you sell that to your clients?
The answer for me would be yes, probably because I'm very enthusiastic about plants and the choices within my design. So I'm only having to convince maybe one or two people. Usually one of the two is the kind of the banker, the purse string holder. But I think it's about how you sell the benefits. So for me, I really need to understand what's so fantastic about this new cultivar or hybrid, and what benefit it's going to bring to the client. If I was in a more commercial sphere, it would probably be a much harder sell because it's literally ones and zeros on a page. But I think it's about promoting the benefits of that plant and the diversity, and also that kind of like one-upmanship that people love. It's the innate competition within people to say, oh, I've got this new cultivar, I've got this new geum, and you don't have it, and this is a wonderful plant. So I think if you approach it from kind of with a method of being enthusiastic and selling the benefits, I don't think it's hard from a design point of view. Commercially, it's probably very different, but I do think that specifically in nurseries and garden centres, having your staff really understand those plants and the new benefits, and to be able to articulate it to customers, landscapers in a really quick method. And I know that Liz said, you have to say it twice. So you might say it once at the point of sale, and then on the label there might be, that strapline benefit of this new plant, so that when they get it back to the client, they can reel that off as well. So it's just really understanding, why have we done it and why is it a good thing?
Josh, commercially, is it doable to upsell a more expensive plant over a more commonplace, cheaper plant, or are you almost always driven by price point?
I think it really sort of depends on the client. I mean, for me personally, I would love to specify new plants in every scheme I work on. But the stuff we tend to work on, as Lee pointed out, is thousands of plants per scheme. We look at sort of large scale projects. So I think we can find areas within our projects to have kind of small areas of new varieties of species. But again, with that, it's sometimes quite hard because you don't know how they're going to react or how they're going to establish in that period, and it can sometimes it can be sort of a costly mistake in effect. I'm just trying to draw on some success stories of new plants really. There was one scheme I worked on. It was a high-end hotel scheme, and I specified a new sort of species of Rebecca. I think it was Rebecca Demoni. The Dreams coneflower was a new variety of that. And that was kind of a big gamble. It was more expensive than the typical Goldstrom you find in schemes. It's sort of a hybrid of that plant. But it took the client some persuasion to include it. I think the whole cost factor came into it, and I didn't think he didn't really understand that this was a new variety and how it would really turn out. But it went ahead. It's still in the scheme now. It's thriving quite well. But I think we just have to sort of break down that barrier and just if we don't specify these new plants, especially commercially, then how are we going to know how they're going to adapt or survive? So I think it's something that we really do need to push, but it depends on the client, really. It really does.
Yeah. Do many of your clients on a commercial scheme have much of an interest in the specifics of plant selection?
It depends on the scheme. So some schemes we work on, the client has a sort of horticulture background, which is nice. But I tend to work a lot more now on sort of urban schemes. So you look at urban pocket parks or sort of plazas and things like that. So really planting, it's like all commercial designs really. Planting is almost sort of the last thing. Once the architect's been in and sourced the materials, the hard landscape out, planting is generally the last thing. So the budget's often very stretched by the time you get to the planting. So trying to convince the client to spend extra on these new varieties of Rebecca's or Echinaceas is sometimes a hard sell. But like I said, I honestly would love to specify more varieties and new species in every scheme, but it is just such a hard sell at the moment, especially with this economic climate we're in now. I think that it's just something I think we've got to break down this barrier, but I think only time will tell if we can do that. But yeah.
Brilliant. Simon, is it an easy sell to pitch new plants to people? Is it something that's a core element of your business?
It's a core element to our business. I think we're lucky at specialising in herbaceous perennials. When you say from a cost perspective, we're not looking at sort of huge price sort of differences. In some cases, you could be looking at about 50p increase, which basically is something we've got to pass on, which is the royalty that we have to pay on a new cultivar. So I don't think it's so much cost that's kind of on most new plants, but I think it's I would say education. It's obviously how do you as a designer find out about these new plants, and it's sometimes difficult to actually, when you're focusing on a design and you've got a palette of plants you've known and trusted to actually pull on these new varieties if you're not aware of them. So from our perspective as a grower, we're very proactive with social media, that sort of thing, and I think we'll only do that if we think that plant is viable, and we're not going to push something that's not going to be of any use. But at the moment we're working on we've actually got a new plant list that we can actually email out to customers. So if anybody's interested, contact us at the
A little
nursery.
bit of a plug there.
Oh, well, I have to, but that's the point is, like I say, it's an education. And yeah, I mean, you know, there's certain plants that come out in the market and I haven't heard about. You know, it's one of those kind of industries where, you know, certain countries will specialize in a particular species of plants. And if you're not on the ball, they kind of, yeah, they float on by. So it's really about, you know, sort of, you know, for me as a grower is yeah, pimping them, you know, letting our customers know all about them as best we can.
And is it an easy sell?
Yes and no. Yeah, I get people very sort of, yeah, they've used a particular plant and they don't want to stray from that. But in some cases, I think Azure Rush is the best, geranium Azure Rush, and we'd run out of Roseanne one particular year, and we said, look, we've got this, and it was almost a begrudgingly kind of like taken as, oh, well, look, if you haven't got Roseanne, I'll take it. And cut a long story short, they don't use, this particular customer doesn't use anything else other than Azure Rush in a small garden scenario now. So that was more of a, you know, kind of from their perspective, you know, oh, we'll take it because there's nothing else available. But yeah, we try our best to try and, you know, promote new plants. Yes.
Liz, is it an easy sell to pitch new plants to your customer base?
Well, I think the easy answer is yes and no, to be fair. And I think the difficulty is before we actually even get to the point where we're selling to a customer is actually for us as growers and, you know, sellers of plants is to actually find the correct information. Because obviously sometimes in new varieties, the actual information that you can find on those plants is quite, you know, it's not greatly detailed. So you have to spend a lot of your time researching, or obviously going back to the grower and getting more information. But also, I think it depends. There was a range of plants we got in last year called Proven Winners, and it's all sorts of shrubs basically, all bred, sorry, to be small, compact flowering, all that sort of things, low maintenance. So when we got these in, I sat down and thought, right, okay, yeah, I need to have a look at these so I can get the descriptions right. Now, these plants, so the cultivar name is called one name on this side of the Atlantic and a completely another name on the other side of the Atlantic. So even from our point of view, to actually gather that information to then be able to inform A, our staff, and B, then our customers, was an extremely long-winded job. And, you know, then also, of course, every single one of our sales staff has got to be an expert on these within a week. You know, so it's kind of how we get the information to us in the first place. You know, as people that buy and sell plants, and then onto the actual consumer. And I think sometimes these can be quite slow burners. I mean, if I go back to the Ilex crenatas, I can't tell you how many times I promoted those when they first came in. And yet 2 years ago, a customer who was on site, he's on site at least once a week, just happened to get talking to him. He said he was having problems with his buttress balls and caterpillar. And I said, well, what about the Ilex? And I took him up there, and this guy had walked past these plants or this area for the last 5 years, just assuming they were boxed. So it's also how you promote things on site once people are actually here, because you can email, you can inform people, you can write it on the label, and you can do all of that. But people still sometimes come on site and they're in a hurry. You know, they don't want to sort of sit back and have a look at something new. I mean, what we tend to do in a normal year is we have a sort of an open week once a year in the autumn where we highlight new varieties, and we get quite a good turnout for that. We tend to get a lot of designers in, a lot of students, but you know, there are some areas of our customer database where we don't get a lot of people in that day. You know, and it's sort of, you know, how many, you know, the opposite of trying to sell it more than once or twice is how many times can you actually put that information out there. So yeah, it's difficult. What we did do with some of the new introductions is we gave some of the plants to our designers to trial in gardens, and that worked quite well. There was one particular designer we gave some new hydrangeas to, and you know, she grew them well. The customer liked them, she liked them. From all perspectives, that was great. But obviously, as a business, we can't do that with everybody. So it's a really difficult thing to get across to people, to be fair.
Well, you segued on brilliantly to my next question then, which is about trialing plants. Obviously, as you say, we often are presented with a nice picture and perhaps some ideally grown examples of plants when we're looking at them at trade shows. And that's not necessarily the picture that we're going to get when we try and do it ourselves. Do you physically plant up examples on your own sites to trial? Is that something that you've done at all, Liz?
Yes, we have actually. A few years ago, after one of our Hampton Court shows, we built a staff garden out the back with plants from Hampton Court, and also trialled some new varieties in there. This year, unfortunately, if I'm really honest, it's been a tad neglected, but that's just because we haven't had everybody on site at the same time. But it is quite interesting every now and again to just nip in and see how things are growing. We are actually looking in the next year or so of moving that garden up to the new area, so that will be a lot bigger. And one of the things I put forward is to trial new varieties up there, because I can sit here and say, yes, it worked for me in my garden, but actually literally trotting someone up to the plant and saying, look, here it is, it works, or actually, no, you're right, it failed. You know, and we don't know why, you know. But one of the other things that we do internally is we have a sort of group of people here on site that we basically give them new plants, they take them home and trial them. Again, not really hugely done well this year, but we sort of ask for a feedback sheet on that. And that's something we're looking at doing and expanding on a little bit more. Because I always think if you have that experience from a plant, then you're more likely to be able to sing its virtues and to be able to say, yes, I know it works, or no, you know, I tried that and it didn't work. So there are the two things that we do on site. We want to do a bit more of them, particularly, Richard doesn't know this yet, but he will do soon, obviously. I'd like to replant the driveway with some of the proven winners range, because you know, we are promoting them heavily for what they do, and they're supposed to be absolutely fantastic, but I'd like to see them actually do it in the flesh. And then I can sort of, right, okay, guys, here it is, it works, hopefully. So yes, we do have some on site, but not actually anywhere where our customers can see them, which is, you know, something we need to probably work on, in fairness.
Josh, big part of the University of Sheffield development was in trialing plants and seeing how they work. Are you a subscriber to this?
Yeah. So I follow a lot what the university does. I'm just thinking now of the Olympic Park in London. So it's a big sort of flagship project for the university. There's a lot of wildflower mixes that went into the meadows there, and a lot of academic research went into that by James Hitchmore and Nigel Dunnett. A lot of those species used in the sort of Olympic Park scheme. It was the first time really they've been used in the UK as well. So a lot of those species really came from Central Asia and again North America. So for me, it's really interesting to not only see how it performed for the Olympic Games in 2012, but also sort of the subsequent years after that. So still going now, it still looks as good as it does in 2012. And for me, that's kind of a good thing to look at really when you look for these schemes which trial new plants. I mean, I don't often get a chance to trial them in our work that we do for the commercial sector, but this is where I think domestic horticulture and gardening is really key. So I've got friends who are really into gardening. My parents have got a really kind of nice cottage garden back home. I remember a lot of my early inspiration came from the gardens I used to go and visit, and the new plant species I used to see. So I think in terms of commercial design anyway, academic research and finding these schemes is pretty key.
Brilliant, thank you. Lee, the Exploding Atom Garden, a trial ground?
Yeah, I suppose it is. The Exploding Atom Garden, for anyone that's not seen my work, is my own concept garden at home. So I left the city a few years ago and moved to the middle of nowhere, which is why I'm sat in a lay-by doing this Zoom call, because we have no broadband at the moment. But yeah, I designed this concept garden, which at its very core, it was to use a mix of native and also non-native species that would kind of survive the seasons and create this really dramatic, high-impact, herbaceous garden. And there's very little in terms of evergreen structure in there. It's all about seasonal change. I grew a lot from seed. I know I bought a number of plants from you, Lewis, and other nurseries to kind of see how they work. Now, I'm based in the Northwest, so we have really wet winters. We don't have the best of summers, but I've been quite amazed at how plants can adapt, especially when you're planting them en masse, which isn't something that as a garden designer I get to do, very frequently. A lot of the gardens that I work in are quite small, but with the Exploding Atom Garden, what I've been able to do with especially with different cultivars of the same plant species, to see really what the winners and the losers, and how planting them en masse actually gives them a bit more protection. So I've been able to do my own plant trials, particularly amongst prairie plants. That's one of my sort of real loves. The Rebecca plant species I absolutely adore, and I've got a number of different cultivars, some grown from seed, some bought in as sort of specimen plants. But yeah, I think to answer the question, to be able to really understand the plants that you're trying to sell or recommend, in my case, to a design client, you really have to have some form of first-hand experience. So I think Liz is correct, and Simon, in trying to showcase them either in the ground or showcase established forms of those plants. It's easy to look at it in a pot when it's been grown in a polytunnel. It's at its best to go, oh, that's nice. And then you plant it out and it has a bad winter, and suddenly you think, God, what's that? And I can't even remember what it is. It's just a bit of a tatty mess. But we've got to kind of experience that ourselves and then be able to articulate it to the customer to say, from these months of the year, it'll look fab. These months, not so much. But if you companion plant it with some other stuff to distract away from it when it disappears back down, and that's the way to do it, is to be able to give the solution to almost that temporary problem of when plants aren't in season or when they're not looking their best. And I think that's what a lot of amateur gardeners, garden centre goers and weekend gardeners miss, is that they can't get past the fact that this plant has changed. Is wrong with it, where it's about seasonality and having other things take over when certain plants aren't looking the best, or are going into their own little hibernation mode over the winter. And I think that the trials in particular allow you to articulate that to potential customers.
Simon, you're a trialer. In fact, your dad, I know your dad's the trialer, isn't he, really? Dad's garden.
I always say to people, customers, I say, oh yes, we trial this in our trial garden. It makes it sound sort of this official kind of like, sleeper beds tucked away, and we're taking notes every day. But no, it's mum and dad's garden here at the nursery. So, but there's no better place to try a plant. It's one thing saying that, like Lee said, we're growing in what you could call ideal conditions, but they need to be tried and tested in the real world. Now, we have an insight into new plants, new introductions, because we're Lewis, you probably know this, but we're actually trialing some vinca that we're hoping to launch into the market. Well, there's a very stringent trials process. You can't just come up with a new plant and go, bam, launch it into market and hope everything's okay. The vinca we're working on, they're saying that there's a minimum of 3 years you've got to trial it on your own site to see to make sure it doesn't revert back to the original colour. There's a lot of work that goes into launching new plants, but I think so many plant breeders are based in North America, and again, that's obviously for a completely different sort of environment to the UK. So, like you say, we get lots of pretty pictures, and it's been trialled for X amount of years, and it's a fantastic plant. Well, we don't really know that until they reach these shores, and we've had some really expensive mistakes on the back of some new plants, even in what you call perfect environment. And like I say, Echinacea being the prime example of that. Even you give them in theory everything they need under cover in the winter, keep them bone dry, and you still lose 50%. So yeah, it's really important to trial these plants. I wouldn't start, kind of pushing them out on customers if I didn't think they were a viable, reliable plant.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of the sort of natural questions, but we've got lots from our audience. So it might be easier if you all unmute and hopefully don't all talk over one another, but I'll read out some of the questions and we'll see how many we can get through. Right back an hour ago, Richard Rogers asked if, to what extent do designers' plant lists, or do we see designers' plant lists expanding versus narrowing? Are we likely to see a greater number of plants appearing consistently on designers' lists, or are they going to be becoming more finite, and are there various factors that might contribute to that? So probably more of a nursery question to start with. Liz?
It's a really difficult question to answer, actually, because it totally depends on the designer and how open that person is to embracing new varieties and trying new plants and trying new things. I think with any relationship with a customer is we have become so email dependent that I actually think put the emails away for a minute and actually phone up and discuss with your supplier what you're looking for. And that's when actually I think in most honest cases when you find out about new varieties and things. And I think also new varieties will also always be price dependent. And I think that will also dictate whether people will try these new varieties and things. And as I say, I think that's, and I think it also depends on the new varieties. If we go to Hughes, there are 1,000 varieties that all look particularly similar to me. So, if one isn't available, then if we've got the knowledge, we can, sub another one to you or suggest another one to you. And it depends on how open that person is to receiving that information in the first place. So I think it's a sort of a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, really.
Simon, are we seeing a narrowing or an expanding?
I'm with Liz. It's so difficult. And I don't mean to overgeneralise and make this sound as though it's going to come out, but on the Monday morning when we look in the inbox and if you covered up the headers of all the the orders we're picking for that week, you'd have no idea who's who, because everybody's using a very similar palette of plants. And I don't mean that as a, oh, well, come on, everybody broaden your horizons. I get it. We're wanting reliability, plants we can trust, and I totally get that. I think going back to the gentleman's question is do you see that palette broadening or narrowing? Again, a great question, because again we're coming back down to what is climate change. We're looking at not seasons now, we're looking at extremes. That's either hot, cold, wet, dry, it not necessarily in that order. And it's got to be a palette of plants that you can rely on and trust. And so part of me thinks you could argue that palette might narrow, because certain plants can't sustain the long, hot, dry summers. They can't sustain. They're not happy in the long, wet winters. But that's where I say new plants do have a place in the market, where slight variants of something that you can and trust. But it's a really good question, and who knows where that's going to lead, but certainly from a disease resistance, that I hope we'll see the palette broaden on that front. But I think when Josh was saying earlier on, a lot of prairie plants incorporated into urban projects, that sort of thing. But we've got these wet winters, and so I don't know. It's another debate. But you can go back to sort of. The soil makeup, and we've got to look at how we manage the actual the soil that they're going into. Is that soil going to have the kind of ability to sort of be free draining, and also during the summer months obviously incorporating irrigation? That's a different debate altogether,
and doesn't even include anything to do with Brexit or phytosanitary rule changes.
Don't get me started on that.
That's another bombshell.
The last 10 minutes.
We've got, I think we've answered a few questions in our process, but we've got a couple of other questions that I want to kind of run through as we can. From Ellie Parker, we've got, are trends for hard materials like natural stone, wood features following changing trends in plant palettes, or do they remain consistent? So as we look to use different construction materials, are we tailoring our plant selection in a different direction? Lee, over to you on that one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the difficulty with hard landscaping materials and incorporating new ones is that you need some form of landscaper or builder that can then work with them confidently to get that desired result. So I think out of everything, your hard landscaping materials are probably the slowest to evolve because people get used to working with certain materials. At the moment, you know, all sorts of natural stone are mega popular. They've become more attainable, more affordable. I would love to work with more materials, different materials, and using them in new ways. But it is about finding people that are competent and comfortable in doing that, because there's nothing worse than, as a designer, designing something that looks and feels, you know, innovative and incredible, and you sell it to the client and you do your rough costings, and then you come to actually get it realized using contractors, and you find that there's very few people that will touch it. So it's really tricky. I tend to be led by what the best in the business are doing in terms of hard landscaping themselves, and then I tweak my own residential designs based on that. For show gardens, that's always a different matter, because you are, by your very virtue, pushing the boundaries, pushing the envelope. But I think that, if anything, hard landscaping materials are slower to change and respond compared to plants.
Josh, what's your position on that?
I think on a commercial scale, shifts are generally changing at the moment. We're kind of seeing a more of a lighter colour palette in terms of hard materials, especially in city centres and high streets. There's also this big push towards sustainability as well. I'm just trying to think now. We're almost seeing less of a resilience now on granite. So a lot of our granite was kind of imported from Europe and overseas, and China as well. So we're seeing less kind of less granite being used. I think this is a real sort of big push towards sustainability. I think timber as well in city centres is starting to have a resurgence. Again, that kind of plays on with the trend sort of thing. But I think a lot of the commercial sort of hard landscape is based on global projects as well. So I talked before, this website called Landzine. It's interesting to see how shifts are changing in Europe and North America, and we're sometimes we're picking that up as well. So it's I think it's quite an interesting discussion, and I think it's a separate kind of talk to have almost. But yeah,
yeah, the combinations and how they relate, and also the sustainability of them. I think actually one of the themes of the questions that I've seen quite a lot of here relate to sustainability, to wildlife, and going back, I think a lot of that has to do with the period of time we spent in lockdown, and everyone suddenly becoming much more engaged with the space that they can control, even if they're not able to access other spaces. So plant trends in terms of wildlife, have you noticed any kind of major changes there, and do you see anything on the horizon, Liz?
I would say really that the sort of main changes that I've really seen are, as I say, the sort of changes towards things like grasses and extending the flowering season for late flowering plants for pollinators. I was in a garden on Saturday with a client, and he was absolutely over the moon that there was a bee on his arbutus flower, you know, at this time of year. And the simple pleasure that he took out of seeing that bee at this time of year was really lovely to watch. And I think with the sustainability and the wildlife aspect, something that sort of flowers later than the summer, you know, and is actually or earlier if we're looking at the other end of the spectrum, you know, early in the winter, something that can provide nutrient for something other than your actual self, I think is really a big trend at the moment. And actually as I say, the pleasure on this guy's grown man's face, mortgage advisor, you know, not hugely into his garden. The smile on his face was just an absolute real pleasure to see, you know. And I think it's silly things, it's little things like that actually, you know, he then pulled his son over and he was getting his son involved. And I think there's that sort of aspect as well, where we have all spent a lot more time at home this year, you know, have spent a lot more time in our own gardens. It's you just notice so much more. We all have time to sort of stop and take it in for a little while, and I think that's sort of something that we could, as an industry, also good for mental well-being as well. So anything that flowers later or flowers earlier really is sort of, I think, you know, an attractive habit.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. I'll try and get through as many questions as we can doing it. There's an interesting question on has us not having any shows, or only, you know, 1 or 2 shows this year, has it had an effect on where we think trends will be in 2021? Anybody want to chip in? It'll be one person just for a couple of minutes tops. No. Okay.
Well, I mean,
someone's got to have an opinion on this.
go on, I've got an opinion, but go on, Simon, over to you.
Last year was the first year we didn't grow for Chelsea in 10 years. And I think that's your ultimate insofar as when, you know, trends are kind of born is at Chelsea. And I think, you know, that certainly from a colour perspective, it's going to be this romantically flowing kind of, you know, cottagey garden look, and you know, and certainly trends can be come off the back of that. Well, not having had Chelsea, you know, and who knows what happens next year. We are being approached already for, you know, Chelsea for next year, so who knows? But yeah, I don't know. It's been quite refreshing not having that kind of question constantly bombarding me. So what's the new trend at Chelsea this year? And I kind of like sink back in my chair, because, you know, Chelsea is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. Chelsea's great. It's a great spectacle, but we tend to find that the trends don't really overlap into the real world. And that, you know, you do see these lovely romantically flowing gardens, but full of, you know, delphiniums, lupins. But we all know as growers, designers, that that's a very high maintenance style of gardening. And you know, when you see it on Chelsea or the client says, I want that garden. But when it comes to the crunch and you know, well, have you got the time, the expertise, staking, you know, all these different aspects to gardening, invariably the answer is no. And so it has been a bit of it sounds awful, but you know, some of the pressure's been taken off of us as growers without having that question on, you know, what's the trend at Chelsea this year? So, but who knows going forward?
Yeah, I actually think it's a good thing this year that we've had a breather from the trends, because it's made the sort of people that use my services dig a bit deeper into finding the right plant, rather than just serving up to me, here's a hydrangea runaway bride, I want a garden full of that. And I have to say, well, you know, we can incorporate one, but there's other hydrangeas, there's different, you know, shrubs that we can use. But I think it's enabled people to do their own research and therefore get more connected with the vast world of plants, rather than taking the fashion tip and then just trying to sort of apply it on top of their garden. So personally, I think it's a good thing that we've had a year off trends.
Josh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think trends in terms of show gardens sort of vary from each year to. I'm just trying to think. I was meant to do a show garden this year at Chatsworth, but unfortunately it was cancelled because of COVID. I just think it also, in terms of the show gardens, it depends on the month they're situated in as well. So you're quite restricted by the palette of plants for that particular month. So I'll just give an example now of Chatsworth. It's normally in June, and June is a difficult month in terms of flowering sort of species. It's almost a transition month before sort of the key bloomers in July. So I think your palette for show gardens is very restricted, but this is where you've got to be really creative as a designer. You've got to find all these combinations and use the same plants, but in different combinations and different varieties. So I think that's hard. But in show gardens, the trends I think also stem from sort of nurseries, the plants they're stocking as well that particular year. So I think it does vary, but no, it's a good question.
Okay, before I ask the last question, there is one here from Anne-Marie O'Keefe that Nikki Jackson has also followed up on, where they're asking if there are any nursery associations like the APL that do webinars so that they can gain from shared experience with the designers. Personally, I would say that there are associations that hold nurseries together or work with multiple nurseries, but they're not particularly well geared to communicating in that way. So I think it's probably a bit of a shortfall in the market. But what I would say is that it's really very important that you just have good working relationships with your nurseries. You know your point of contacts and visit them when it's safe to do so regularly, so as to see plants that appear. Our final question it's the, you know, it's the one we've all been waiting for, from Martin Idles, is how do you think Brexit will affect lead times and prices? Yeah, Simon, you look stunned and scared. I'm going to have to start with you.
Right, okay, yeah. And I've got, what, 30 seconds to answer a 3-hour question,
quickly,
right?
please, because we've got a minute.
Right, okay. The long and short of it is that I don't need to like to use the word disastrous, but you know, it is for our industry not great insofar as the certainly the importation export of plants means that the price will go through the roof. We're looking at a no deal scenario at the moment, which is looking highly likely. We're looking at between 10 and 11% duty immediately put on plants. That's without us even thinking about the bureaucracy, paperwork, the brokers, the software getting material in and out of this country. Lead times, really important to say that I think it's so important that the days, I think, unfortunately have gone insofar as we can offer this kind of, you know, we can get material in from abroad within, you know, 3, 4, 5 days, and you know, logistics wise, that's how the Dutch, the Belgians work, and you know, that's, yeah. Let's not forget there's a fantastic opportunity. Let's not be doom and gloom for the UK grower.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so many opportunities. So it's not all doom and gloom. I don't want to kind of go, well, God, you know, what disasters for the industry. But the problem is that from the seed company we use is German, the plug, the liner, the bare root, a majority material that we as growers, I'm growing 500,000 plants on site, and probably 60 to 70% of that material will start at some point on the continent in Europe. So we're UK grown, but we're reliant as an industry on the foreign imports. But at the moment, yeah. 10, 20, 30 years down the line, let's look at it as a great opportunity. And certainly from a biosecurity point of view, we could keep it in-house, and yeah, let's be positive.
Liz, what's your feeling?
Well, I've probably got about 10 seconds, so I would say less than. Okay, put your prices up and look at your lead times and get that across to your customers, because although this may be an opportunity for British horticulture in the next 20, 30 years, in terms of some of the larger, more Mediterranean style shrubs, that they will still, I assume, come from the continent for quite some time to come. So I would say any quotes you're doing for your customers now, just make them aware that prices may change and that lead times will be affected for at least the first 6 months until actually a proper importing structure is put in place. But I believe this is all covered in the nursery debate at, I think it's 2 o'clock. So that's a whole big one. Less than 10 seconds is not enough.
That was brilliant. Lee and Josh, do you agree that you're going to be more prepared now to buy with longer lead times and pay more money for it?
It's just preparing the clients for that, really. And for me, it's about telling them, you know, that it's the unknown, it's best in others, and you know, very quickly that's where plant substitutions are really valuable, and getting your clients ready to accept substitutions is not as a shortfall to the original plant, but something that can take its place. Because you know, if you go with a really rigid planting scheme, more often than not, you just get stuck to it rather than going for what's available.
Josh, anything?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think plant prices potentially go up on certain species. I think as well, certain UK-based design practices may see less work in Europe now, which is another issue potentially.
Yeah.
So that's something that we have to consider. But no, I think it's I think the costs will go up, but that's something that's we're going to have to sort out when the time comes. But yeah. Brilliant,
thank you. So all that remains then is for me to thank everyone watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. To thank Simon from How Green, Lee, our garden ninja, Josh from University of Sheffield, and Liz from Provender. And from me, thank you very much and have a lovely day. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.